Hey there, I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Fawn Parker is a novelist and poet whose writing often dives headfirst into the complex emotions surrounding loss. Her latest book is the novel Hi, It's Me, which follows a woman who's also named Fawn on the day her mother dies. It's a work about the disorienting, searing, and deeply personal experience of grief that also explores power dynamics, the patriarchy, and shame. Hi, It's Me is a work of fiction, but there are many parallels between the main character and Fawn, the author, herself. And that blur between fiction and reality definitely contributed to me feeling like I was jumping into Fawn, the character's skin. It was an uncomfortable but deeply, deeply rewarding read. And I'm not the only one who thought Hi, It's Me was fantastic. Hi, It's Me is also a finalist for this year's Atwood Gibson Writers' Trust Fiction Prize. Fawn Parker is a PhD student at the University of New Brunswick and the Poet Laureate of Fredericton. She joined me in person in the studio in Toronto for this conversation. Hi, Fawn. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm not too bad. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I want to ask, obviously, Hi, It's Me, I think, draws so much on your personal experience, but I want to know, when did the idea for transforming that personal experience into a book come to you, and why did you want to write a novel like this?
I was at this point that I often arrive at as a novelist where I had no next idea, which for me is very stressful. I like to be working on a manuscript at all times. And I did have this archive of my mother's handwriting, grocery lists, her diary, and I had just all this text, and it felt like something I really wanted to do something with. I at least didn't want to get rid of it, and so I think it felt like a way to use it and then let it go, rather than just throwing it out and sort of feeling like it had gotten lost in time. So I started to draw on her archive as a way of building plot around who she was, who I felt she was, who I felt she was after reading all of that, what it meant ethically that I read all of her journals and looked through all of her diaries. And then that's sort of where this book spiraled out of.
Yeah, so Hi, It's Me, it's billed as a work of fiction. It has like this standard kind of disclaimer that all fiction has at the beginning, where it's like any resemblance to persons living or dead is coincidental. But there are these strong parallels to your own life, and you're describing that this is a work that's born out of going through your mom's archives and sort of like what's left of a person after they die. How did you like strike a balance while writing this work? And like the question that I kept having as I was reading is I was like, how much of this is like real and memoir-like, and how much of it is creative license?
I like to think of it as an emotional memoir or emotional autobiography. It's sort of, that is how I felt grieving in the early days. That's sort of the surreal, overwhelming feeling of the day that she died. But those events are fictional. The characters, other than myself and my mother, are made up. And so I think it was a way of sort of blending those things and seeing how they interacted throughout the course of this fictional day, using my memories, my feelings, things that I maybe did or said that day, but to people I didn't say them to.
Right.
And I found that really creatively stimulating.
There's a lot of stuff in here that I found like really resonated, having also lost a parent at a relatively young age. And one is this thing that Fawn in the book does where she's like looking for signs of her mother and almost wanting like evidence of her mom's continued presence on Earth even after death. She sees the number 108 everywhere, which is her mom's house number. Why do you think like people are so drawn to seeking those kinds of signs after loss, even when they maybe realize it's like not totally rational? Because I've definitely done that. I've read interviews with lots of other artists who've done work on grief who've also said they've done this. And it's like a weird brain quirk. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's hard not having religion as someone who hasn't ever and doesn't now. So for me, at least, it felt like a just in case kind of procedure. I don't think that my mother's out there. I don't think she's hearing us now. But I just thought, if she is sending some kind of signal, how stupid if I'm not listening for it. And so I would think, well, maybe she's that bird in that tree, or maybe she's a number that keeps showing up, or maybe in my dreams, that's the real her. And I think it was just a lot of precaution that ultimately, I'm not doing that today, but I think it was helpful as a stage to move through. And I definitely played it up in the novel.
Did you find, like, after your mom passed away, did you find that you dreamed, like, was she in your dreams a lot?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know if you found this with the parent you lost, but she went through different stages. At first, I would dream about her dead, and we would talk about it, and she'd say, well, now I'm dead, so I can't, whatever.
Like whatever thing you want me to do in your life, I can't
I'm
help
not available.
you.
And then she would be ill in my dreams, but alive. And now if I do dream about her, which is rare, she's young. She's sort of in her 30s, and we're peers. So it's been a very strange transition.
That's really interesting. I've spoken to other people who've lost parents sort of like also at a young age, and they sometimes talk about like a present absence in a dream where it's like, they're trying to call the parent that they've lost, and the phone is like just not, it just keeps ringing or whatever. And there's actually this device of the phone in your book as well. Like that's where the title of the book shows up, that Fawn's mom calls her one last time before her scheduled medically assisted death, and the voicemail message is just sort of, "Hi, it's me," and then her mom starts crying. How did you settle on that as the title and this device of this like last communication being a voicemail message that Fawn's mom is like, "Don't pick up. I want to just leave it to you as a recording"?
Right. I think, that phrase really encapsulates her. It was the way she started all phone calls. She would call the bank and say, "Hi, it's me." And often she'd be met with like, "Who's me?"
Yeah.
So I thought it was sort of a cute personal quirk of hers. But it also, I think, speaks to, for me, the way that the me identity changes so much. And reading through her journals, I feel like I didn't necessarily know who me was. I knew who my mother was through a certain lens of being a young daughter. And I know who I am to her and who I am to other people. So I think I like the ambiguity of me. But it's also just a direct quote from her living life.
Yeah. I've read in some of the other press that you've done that you enjoy writing character more than you enjoy writing plot. And this definitely feels like a book that's more about character than about plot, given that it is taking place in this very time-limited period. Why do you feel as a novelist you're drawn to character over plot?
I think that's what I'm drawn to in life as a person, is other people. I find often if someone's telling me a story, I'm so much more interested in what they were feeling or who they are than what actually happened. So I don't know if that's just something about me or why I prefer literary fiction to genre fiction, but I just find that's what story is to me, is the particularities of a person and why they did what they did rather than just what it was.
Yeah. I want to circle back to Fawn's mother's house in this book. It's a very unconventional living situation that she's in. Fawn's mom, at the time that she dies, was sharing a home with 4 other women, her sister, 2 sisters-in-law, and then this like other woman that they met because they hired her to paint something in the house. And they live by this really strict set of rules that isn't religious, but is very restricted in a way that I most commonly associate with people who adhere to a religion. And the most impactful of these on their lives, I would say, is that they just don't speak to men at all or have any engagement with the men in their community. Why did you want to write about this sort of lifestyle and this kind of like approach to life that these women have?
That was something that I always struggled with my relationship with my real mother and her circle of women friends. Was I think our feminism was just a shade off, or maybe many shades off. But she was so empowered and strong, and, everyone's ex-husband should be banished. And I wanted to support her in the journey that I saw her take, which was one of strength. But she also stood for things that I think were not nuanced enough for us to come to agreement a lot of the time. So I think this was my way of dramatizing that friction of like, totally, I love that these women have found this life, but they're just not quite there in terms of what we're actually fighting for as an oppressed gender, moving past 2 genders. I think they just feel a bit lost in time. And so I wanted to sort of highlight Fawn's discomfort between worlds in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting because like Fawn's mother in the book, I think, is very clearly grappling with some tensions that she feels around gender it's like she's the person who's had this idea to have this women's commune and to live this life that's separate from men. But she also almost feels kind of the least in that lifestyle of the women that are living in this farmhouse. And she has this other life that's separate from the farmhouse, really up until the point where she gets so sick that she kind of realizes death is inevitable for her. And she was working on this dissertation about Ulysses. And there's a quote that I want to read where Fawn is talking about her mom, and she says, "My understanding is she had something to prove. A big book, a difficult one, a masculine one. It immediately communicates that she is more than woman." I was wondering what your relationship to womanhood is and how that's maybe influenced you as a writer and perhaps your choice of subject matter or style or anything.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the humor in that quote you just read is that this is my biggest book yet, my big masculine book. And I've always had a very complicated relationship to it that has not gotten any more clear. And I think I use fiction in a big way to explore that and what it means and why I have this imposter syndrome with womanhood, which has been relieved by the fact that we're sort of expanding and broadening what that can mean for anybody. But my mother and I think, shared this feeling of not quite in whatever direction we were. We just weren't quite something. So I found her, in a way, a helpful mentor in that and just kind of existing between spaces. But she definitely fought against femininity a lot of the time.
What were some of the things about femininity that you felt were fraught? And in what ways were those things perhaps different than what your mom felt was difficult about femininity?
Yeah, good question. I think for her it was simple and straightforward what she wanted to pick and choose. So she wanted, I think sexuality was something she really felt powerful in. She was like, very traditionally beautiful with jewelry and clothing and makeup, but really resisted ideas of not being intellectual. And so I think did a lot of work. She had a whole bunch of degrees in, everything, Latin and library science. And she was a lawyer. And so I think disliked a lot of what she felt or maybe internalized about womanhood. And for me, it just became almost like fighting against my mother's femininity. And there's a lot of that in the book with not knowing sort of sexually what to do, having this role model who's very sensual and beautiful and just kind of feeling like an awkward question mark.
Is there anywhere that you've found space perhaps to like exercise power, either tied to femininity or not, in your life?
I think in sort of learning new ways to be a woman who's not my mother. I think we were very enmeshed, as is probably evident in the book. But that was for me what being a woman was. And the parts that she rejected were the parts that I rejected. And I think with that comes a lot of disorder, taking on cultural pressures to be skinny and whatever else. So I think becoming a kind of woman that is my own has been a little bit relieving. And I sort of had a rare curse of looking identical to my mother if you put us side by side. So it was hard to see myself as another thing. Even now I look in the mirror and I look like my mother at 30 and I'm sure I'll look like my mother at 40.
Yeah. Have you had that experience, I guess, of like, I've read other folks who've lost parents at a relatively young age talking about feeling like they're turning into the parent that they've lost, either physically or personality-wise as they get older. Is that an experience that you've ever felt you've had, like as time has passed since your mom's death?
I think I've had the opposite. I think when she first died, I felt like I had to carry the legacy forward. So I was us.
Yeah.
Hi, it's me. And now I think I have some healthy space and some healthy therapy. And I feel that I've almost, at times I feel this twinge of betrayal, like I'm betraying her and the way that we used to be together. But I think there's a lot of health in appreciating who she was and loving our relationship and the memory of her, but not needing to necessarily stay true to that in unhealthy ways.
We've been talking a lot about the experience of womanhood as it's depicted in your book, the ways that women exist within and resist the patriarchy, from like these women that are refusing to speak with men to the ways in which character Fawn kind of like navigates sexuality and has this very tense relationship, I would say, with her body in relation to men. But there's also, like, I would say, depictions of actual relationships between, say, fathers and daughters, both in Hi, It's Me and then also in What We Both Know, one of your prior books. These relationships where men and women are talking to each other are not super functional in the way that you've written them, I would say. Why do you find yourself writing these kinds of male-female relationships?
They just feel real to me. I think a lot of those power dynamics, even if in small ways, are at play all the time, just in how we enter a room. And I think a lot of that is projection and internalization. But if I enter a room with an older man, there's a protocol that we go through and I act a bit shyer. And I think there's a lot of subconscious messaging that we all carry around with us. So I find it really interesting to look at those relationships closely and unravel them and see what happens during those reversals. Like in my previous novel, a woman is caring for her father when he's starting to have dementia. And what does that mean when suddenly he needs her, this patriarch? So I think for me, it's really interesting to see how much of that is real and how much of that we just sort of let float around us without challenging it.
How much insight do you feel you've gained through writing this fiction about these power dynamics between men and women?
Maybe more insight into my own assumptions than I don't think I've learned anything about the rest of the world by turning inward. I think it's more that I realize how much I allow into the room with me and how much I judge myself against some weird gold standard of a woman or what I think about men. And I have a male partner, and so I think about our power dynamic and our genders sometimes. And I think a lot of it is just the story that we tell ourselves and how much we buy in. Sometimes is a choice and sometimes isn't, but I try to find those moments where it is maybe something I can peel back.
Yeah. Has there been can you give like any specific example maybe of a belief that you had about how things have to be or inherently are between men and women that you found challenged through writing fiction?
That's a great question. I think emotional honesty feels like something that maybe I was more comfortable with between women. And then there was a point in my life with everybody, maybe it was when my mother died, that I realized I could just say things to my dad the way I'd say them to anyone. And even if he responded weirdly, which he doesn't, that was okay. I could just be authentic. And I think in my fiction writing, that's informed that too, that sort of having my characters be disarmingly honest is really interesting for plot.
Yeah. Have you found, I guess you're saying like, yeah, your dad is just like also a guy that you can talk to? Like, what has it meant for your relationship with him to have that realization?
I think it changed everything with my relationship with everybody. Realizing how much I grew up in this world where things just were not said. I didn't tell my parents I loved them. I didn't say how I was feeling. And then all of a sudden, I think just because everything is stripped away, maybe you felt this too with your family, there's no point in not saying it. So my dad and I would just talk about things we'd never said out loud. It almost felt like we were aliens, but also so natural. It was like this weird dichotomy. And with my partner as well, I have from my first healthy partner ever. And he just says things I didn't realize you were allowed to say. Like when we first started dating, he'd be like, so when do you want to see me again? And I'd be like, you can't say that. You're supposed to act like you don't want to. So I think it just changed. Yeah, it changes every day of my life.
I want to ask about some of your other prior work. We've been talking about What We Both Know, but you're also a poet, and your debut piece of published work, Soft Inheritance, is a prize-winning poetry collection. And I know you've said in the past that writing poetry actually comes easier to you than writing fiction. Why do you think that is?
I think the pressure's off for me with poetry. I've never really felt like it would be my craft. And maybe saying that as the poet laureate with this collection, I'm not right anymore. But it does feel like something I do for me to process emotion. And it kind of just comes out as is. And that's the poem. And I try not to intervene too much. So it feels really enjoyable and natural for me. Whereas writing a novel just feels like going to the office and working. And I love that too in its own way. But it never just flows out the way poetry does. So I think that is probably changing, but it's always just been something that it almost feels like the way that I think my thought patterns come out, the way that my poems are.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention you didn't maybe think of poetry as a craft that you had to work at in the same way because it came naturally. And you mentioned that, now you're the poet laureate of Fredericton, and that maybe, this actually is my job, like in a way that for a lot of poets, it never becomes a job in quite that way. Do you feel like that new role and having this responsibility of like, I have to write poems for the public and to serve this civic purpose, has that changed your relationship with poetry at all?
Definitely. I mean, it's terrifying because now my poems are celebrations of Fredericton, New Brunswick. And I do feel that I can approach that authentically, but it's very different than what I was writing about before. Sort of thinking like, isn't the body disgusting? And here's what my mother looked like dying. And here's what I think about the orgasm. And that's not something I can read at council.
No.
And I won't. But I think there's a way to achieve balance sometimes and still be, the honestly political person that I am, but knowing my context.
Yeah, I'm now curious. I'm like, how do you, as a poet who's worked a lot on talking about bodies being gross and the orgasm and death and illness, how do you like pivot to celebrating Fredericton, New Brunswick?
I don't know. I'll have to tell you in 2 years how it goes. So far, my approach has just been, my first poem, I've only read one at council, was about a depressed friend and taking him on a walk through Fredericton and showing him all the beautiful things. So I think I can inject my depression through other characters now.
I want to circle back to talking about Hi, It's Me. And we've talked a lot about these parallels between your real life and the plot of this novel and the experience that the character Fawn goes through. And I'm wondering whether the process of writing this book was a part of, healing from grief. There was a line in the book that I found very evocative, talking about like the character Fawn not having been present for her mom's death. And then therefore, does it mean that the grief can never be over because there's this like, passing each other in the night, like not being there and it not being final. So with that said, I hate to be like, how did writing the book shape your healing? Because maybe you're not healed. Maybe it's not over. But what do you think about all that?
I do think it's over in the sense that when I finished the book, it felt finished. And now I don't spend every day thinking about my mom. So she'll never not be the mother that I lost. But I do think there was a bit of a closing feeling. And I have the book to thank for that. I actually last fall talked to Tom Power, who's somewhere in this atmosphere, about objects and hoarding things that a dead person leaves behind. And that was a huge thing for me, was not wanting to let anything go. And I had gum wrappers and it was just like very messed up. But I think I sort of had to move through all those stages rather than those classic 7 stages. I had my own stages of like hoarding and drinking.
Yeah.
And I guess stage 7 was finishing the book. And I do feel like I let go of a lot of it.
Yeah. I remember a joke that was really bad that I told a little while back is I said to a friend, I was like, what stage of grief is I'm going to email my literary agent? So it's interesting to hear that maybe you had some of that same feeling. Fawn, thank you so much for joining me today. It was such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was my conversation with Fawn Parker about her novel, Hi, It's Me. This episode was produced by Liv Pasquarelli. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. A big, big thank you to the radio techs who work on this show and to the CBC Books team who handle all things digital, social, and more for us. And speaking of social, CBC Books is now on TikTok. You can follow us at CBC Books. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.